Sunny skies, soft snow on top of a deep snowpack, no crowds or traffic, and a joyous atmosphere shared by all. Sounds like a ski day in paradise, right? While that may be a bit of an exaggeration, one thing that's not is that the late season is an extremely underrated time of year to go skiing. Join us today as we explore everything you need to know about skiing in the late season. For those of you who haven't seen the early season counterpart to this video, be aware that we've done this exact style for that phase of the season, so you can check that out right after this or save it for when you're preparing for the start of next season. A quick disclaimer before we jump fully in. Every late season is different. Locations, weather patterns, and other uncontrollables can shape each season's story to be a little bit unique. We have this experience primarily from late season skiing in Tahoe and a bit of Colorado, so our takes may reflect that perspective. Please bear in mind that this is not fully representative of every mountain in every region's late season. Now let's start by discussing the simplest aspect. When is the late season? This primarily depends on the geographic region and the weather patterns throughout the full season, and everyone's definition is a little different. In Tahoe, in our opinion, the peak season typically runs from around mid-January through mid-March. This peak is, of course, defined by the highest visitation to ski resorts, along with the best snow conditions and the most frequent snowfall. As a more general rule, the end of peak season is defined by the point at which storm frequency drastically decreases and the forecast outlook shifts towards sunny and warm. Thus, the late season runs from that threshold until the end of the season, whenever that may be. Many ski resorts close in April, but some stick around into May and even June. There have even been occasions where Mammoth Mountain or Arapahoe Basin were open on the 4th of July. Now, it's no secret that if you're looking for powder days, you'll generally want to ski during the peak season. However, despite the higher frequency of storms, the deepest snowpack at many western ski resorts often occurs in the late season. For example, Loveland Snowpack typically peaks in late April, Sugar Bowl in early April, and Snowbird in mid-April. Many others peak in mid or late March. So all that's to say that if you don't want to worry about rocks and other things poking up through the snow, you'll likely want to ski at some point during the late season. Of course, despite the snowpack decreasing quite quickly after its peak, the late season is not immune to large or frequent snowstorms. Sometimes you'll even see weather patterns that look very similar to peak season. So even though the common perception is warm, sunny days, it's still important to check the forecast in the late season because the weather can be just as volatile as any other part of the year. Another thing to note is how much the weather can change during the day. In a typical late season pattern, it'll still be quite chilly in the morning, followed by the warmer afternoons most people picture. I'm sure you've heard it 1,000 times, but to prepare for this, you'll be best off dressing in layers. This rapid change in temperature also leads to much different snow quality than what you find throughout the rest of the season. One of the common things you'll hear about is the freeze-thaw cycle, where warm afternoons melt the snow into slush, which then refreezes overnight. This means that many runs can be rock hard in the morning, while the afternoons can become exceptionally soft. This has consequences for how you'll want to ski your day, especially when it comes to choosing which runs to hit. As we said, not every day will follow this pattern, but the freeze-thaw cycle is certainly something to be aware of. When it does snow in the late season, it often snows a little differently than it does during peak season. This can be described by a metric known as SLR, the snow-to-liquid ratio. In a 10-to-1 ratio, for example, 10 inches of snow equals 1 inch of liquid water. Generally speaking, drier snow is more pleasant to ski. Snow with higher SLRs, like 16-to-1, is the world-class blower powder that's famous in places like the Cottonwood Canyons. In the late season, you're much less likely to see those high SLRs and more likely to find snowfall closer to 8-to-1. That difference is huge because wetter snow is heavier and denser, which makes it much more tiring to ski through. You'll often hear this type of snow referred to as concrete. While it's not unheard of during peak season, especially in coastal regions, it's much more common in the late season. When it's not snowing, there are a couple more things to consider about the snow itself. First, it's not 24/7 slush like some people like to claim, which is something we've already touched on. During freeze-thaw cycles, you can end up with sheer ice that's often described as boilerplate or bulletproof. However, when small snow grains freeze and thaw rapidly under the right conditions, they can form what's called corn or sugar snow, which skis smoothly and quickly. Many strong skiers consider corn to be the best snow type, second only to powder. With the freeze-thaw cycle, liquid water can also be released within the snowpack, which can lead to wet slab avalanches on the right slopes. Wet slabs are highly dangerous and destructive, so avalanche danger can actually remain high in the late season even if there hasn't been any recent snowfall. Simply put, don't go into closed terrain. It's much more dangerous than logic might suggest. The final thing to consider about snow conditions is snowmaking. Man-made snow typically forms a more resilient base layer, meaning runs with snowmaking not only open earlier in the season, but also tend to last longer at the end. Snowmaking in October of 2018, for example, helped Arapahoe Basin stay open all the way through the following July. Isn't that wild? Now that you're all experts on the conditions you can expect, let's talk about the late season skiing experience. First, you'll want to check the lift hours. With the start of daylight saving time in early March and the longer daylight hours as winter turns to spring, many resorts extend lift operations beyond the typical 4 p.m. closing time. However, this can also correspond with slightly later start times, although some resorts will operate from 9 to 5. Resorts also seem to be updating their hours on their websites less and less these days, so never be afraid to call and confirm. Once you're actually on the mountain, despite the deep snowpack, don't expect everything to be open. Large sections of many mountains start to close after their spring break rushes for a few different reasons. At this point in the season, visitation declines significantly, so it's often not economically viable for resorts to operate the entire mountain. Additionally, many seasonal workers begin to depart before the very end of the operating window. Some resorts also have agreements with the Forest Service or other governing bodies that affect operations. All that's to say, you'll likely miss out on terrain around the edges of the mountain where the fewest people typically go. In stark contrast to the early season, however, the terrain that is open is often fully available. Instead of having 4 terrain pods with only 2 trails open each, you might only have 3 pods operating in the late season, but each one has all 14 trails open. You can still find moguls and bowl terrain at many resorts, and some will continue offering good tree skiing and even extreme terrain well into the late season. When it comes to specific terrain choices, there are a few do's and don'ts. Under a typical freeze-thaw cycle, you'll generally want to avoid ungroomed off-piste terrain in the morning because it can be extremely difficult to ski when it's icy or bulletproof. Because of this, many people opt to ski afternoons only during the late season, which is a perfectly viable strategy, and honestly something I'd recommend if you plan on sticking to off-piste terrain. Terrain parks also tend to shine during the late season because landings are much softer. However, the softer the snow gets, the slower you'll typically go. Because of that, you'll want to avoid mellow greens and long traverses in the afternoon. Even if you get by just fine during peak season, once that slush starts slowing you down, everything suddenly feels a lot flatter. With that in mind, I'd say that late season skiing usually isn't the best experience for true beginner skiers. While I would recommend it for most other ability levels, the inconsistent snow quality can make things frustrating if you're limited to green terrain. Otherwise, it's an experience that I think everyone should try at least once. When skiing in the spring, there's another factor that very few people consciously think about: solar aspect. Solar aspect simply refers to the direction a slope faces, which determines how much sun it receives during the day. In the northern hemisphere, south-facing slopes get earlier and longer sun exposure than northern-facing slopes. This is why most ski resorts in North America are primarily north-facing, with a few east-facing outliers like Breckenridge. You can see southern exposure in places like Vail's iconic back bowls, which is one of the main reasons those areas experience freeze-thaw cycles even during peak season. In the late season, you may actually want to start your day on south-facing slopes since they soften up the fastest. However, don't stay there too long because by the end of the day they can become extremely thick and slushy, almost like skiing through a milkshake. Instead, later in the afternoon, you'll want to move on to north-facing terrain, which should be reasonably soft without turning into mud. Elevation also matters much more in the late season than it does during peak season. In the middle of winter, it usually doesn't matter whether you ski near the base or up at the summit. But in spring, if you want to ski lower elevation terrain, you'll want to do it earlier in the day and then move higher up in the afternoon. This follows similar logic to solar aspect, since lower elevations warm up faster and earlier than terrain higher up the mountain. Of course, you can always adapt based on how the snow actually feels under your skis. It might go without saying, but if you want to ski well into the late season, and the option is available to you, it may be worth breaking something different out of your ski quiver. Surprisingly, wide powder skis can actually work very well on extremely slushy days if you plan on doing a lot of off-piste skiing. Meanwhile, a good carving ski will handle morning groomers beautifully. Regardless of what you're skiing, make sure to wax your skis for the late season. And if you're heading out in the extremely late season, late April or May, you might want to bring out the rock skis. Similarly to the early season, crowding is very different in the late season compared to the peak season. Ski traffic, crowded lodges, and long lift lines are usually hard to come by. However, there is one important exception: late season powder days. Every once in a while, a storm will drop a foot of snow in mid-April. Resorts aren't going to reopen closed to rain for just one weekend, so what ends up happening is that everyone tries to squeeze in one last great day of skiing. The result is peak season crowds, but packed into a much smaller footprint of open terrain. This situation is rare, but it's definitely something to be aware of. Just remember that if it gets you excited, it probably gets a lot of other people excited too. One of the biggest advantages of late season skiing is simply the vibe. Instead of the peak season atmosphere of, I'm better than you because I skied more vertical yesterday, everyone is just out enjoying the sunshine and appreciating whatever turns they can get before hanging it up for the summer. You'll see more parking lot tailgating and grilling, and far more people eating lunch or having a drink outdoors. And of course, very few people are getting out super early, which means if you do want to ski some icy corduroy, it's a lot easier to do in the late season. Everything we've talked about so far is a general guide to late season skiing, but I want to highlight a few unique experiences as well. The first is Timberline Lodge's Palmer Snowfield on Mount Hood in Oregon. The Palmer lift is typically buried all winter and doesn't even begin operating until spring. It then runs as long as possible, often lasting into August. This terrain is primarily used for summer training by competitive skiers, but there are also lanes open for the general public. Next up is Killington's so-called Superstar Glacier. This is notable for two reasons. First, it's on the East Coast, and second, it's built almost entirely with man-made snow. Throughout March and April, whenever snowmaking windows appear, Killington fires up the snow guns again on the Superstar run in order to build the deepest snowpack possible. In some seasons, it has exceeded 20 feet deep. That depth allows skiing to continue as late as June, although by that point it often turns into what's known as a patch party, where you have to walk between snow patches rather than skiing the entire run continuously. Finally, instead of a specific resort, let's talk about the Pond Skim. The Pond Skim is a classic late season or closing day event where participants attempt to ski or snowboard across the surface of a pool of water. If you've never seen one before, it's great fun for both participants and spectators. Just be aware that very few people actually make it across. It takes quite a bit of skill. Still, it's a beloved tradition, and honestly, who wouldn't want to take a dip in a pool after skiing in 50-degree sunshine? Alright, that's pretty much it as far as the big things you should know about late season skiing. We definitely recommend trying it, but now you know a little more about what to expect so you can decide for yourself. If you enjoyed this video or found it helpful, please consider subscribing to help support this stream. As always, leave any questions down below, and don't forget to check out the early season guide as well, which should be linked on your screen now. Thank you all so much for watching. All my love, I'm out.